you've got big dreams and bad genes, you're in the right place. These shirts are available at barbellapparel.com, link in the description. This video is a comprehensive history of the sport of bodybuilding, with a special emphasis on the exact training methods and principles used to create the world's most famous physiques. We aren't going to start at the beginning, but with this man, the most famous figure in the history of gym culture, Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was the first Mr. Olympia dynasty, winning 7 times between 1970 and 1980. He changed the standards for aesthetics in the sport, sparking an arms race for freakish size and definition that we still feel today. He overcame a thick foreign accent and wooden screen presence, not just becoming the premier movie star in the action genre, but starring in the most iconic movies ever made. It is that very screen presence that inspired multiple generations of kids from every continent in the world to take up weight training where they otherwise wouldn't have. And some of them are the current bodybuilding, powerlifting, and strongman champions that we watch today. We're starting with Arnold because he sits at the crossroads of bodybuilding's past, present, and future. He was mentored by the Silver Era legend Reg Park and IFBB creator Joe Weider. Many of you may have Joe's affordable home gym equipment in your garage right now. He's the face of the golden era of the 60s and 70s, an era many think fondly of for the emphasis of aesthetics over mass, its grassroots feel free of corporate influence, and the bare bones old school approach of hard, simple work as being the recipe for success. And Arnold continues to push the future of the sport, having his name attached to the world's biggest sports festival, the Arnold Classic, which not only furthers the case for bodybuilding and physical culture as a whole, but single-handedly pushed forward the sport of strongman over the last 20 years. That's especially poetic, as the very sport of bodybuilding originated from vaudeville strongman acts of the mid-1800s. This photograph has the entire history of modern bodybuilding within it, the face of the golden age, standing next to the creator of the IFBB, holding the iconic Olympia trophy, representing the world's first bodybuilder. The dive into bodybuilding methods starts before Arnold, before Weider, back to the origins of the man displayed in this statue, Eugen Sandow, the true father of bodybuilding. As a circus performer in the mid-1800s, he developed a physique so influential that it is now forever preserved in bronze. We're going to trace today's methods back to Sandow, methods which worked long before the advent of plate-loaded barbells and machines, before Google Scholar and PubMed, before pre-workout and Spotify. These methods are where the true heart of bodybuilding exists, and we find them back at the beginning in the Victorian strongman era. There is no bigger testament to the power of being a mentor than the story of Eugen Sandow. His legacy, sealed in the form of bodybuilding's highest award, was a direct result of the tutelage he received from performer and innovator Louis Attila, who himself was a student of the first renowned strongman, Italian performer Felice Napoli. Born in 1820, Napoli was a trapeze artist who incorporated gymnastic feats and singing into his show, alongside demonstrations of strength, which included firing a cannon off of his shoulder and lifting a horse while upside down. Variety of skill is going to be a theme here. Louis Attila, otherwise known as Professor Attila, followed in Napoli's footsteps and became even more influential, using his fame to be the first celebrity trainer to the Royals and eventually spreading his influence to New York in 1893. Professor Attila was born in 1844, stood at 5'4" and 175 pounds, and was said to be capable of performing a 200-pound or 90-kilo bent press. Maybe take a grain of salt with the numbers that predate standardized equipment. Attila is credited with inventing that movement along with the Roman chair and the human bridge, otherwise known as the Tomb of Hercules. Attila's inventions, along with his New York gym that hosted J.P. Morgan, composer John Philip Sousa, and boxer James Corbett, made his influence unquestionable, something he knew and freely asserted. $1,000 to any charity if I cannot conclusively prove that every alleged instructor of physical culture in this country is either a former pupil of mine or using one of the systems I have originated and perfected. That was Attila in 1894. Before expanding into the West, Attila hosted in his gym in Brussels a young Friedrich Mueller, who came to be known by Eugen Sandow, born in 1867, who Attila taught and eventually took on tour alongside the magician Bertrand. That's right, strongman feats and magic tricks. It was a good time to be alive. These early performers were true to the spirit of vaudeville, where pageantry and showmanship reigned. It was the driving force of strength culture's popularity, and something that modern strongman culture would do well to preserve. As a 20-year competitor myself, I often wonder what modern strongman would be if it embraced the showmanship of its roots instead of sliding into a sanitized, standardized version of the sport. But that isn't quite a popular opinion, and it's one for a different video. Now we can start to glean insight into the training methods of this era by evaluating A, the writings they sold to the masses, and B, their role as strength performers. Works like Sandow's light dumbbell system, inspired by Attila's 5-pound dumbbell system, promoted very light arm exercises with 5-pound weights, done for blistering high reps of 50 to 100. The secret, they claimed, was in dynamic tension, that is, squeezing the hell out of the weights with every other muscle while doing the movement. This was, of course, the first example of clever marketing taking precedent over solid training advice. The programs were certainly difficult if done correctly, and likely resulting in some changes in strength and physique if adhered to religiously. But the prescription had exponentially more to do with making training appeal to the masses. 5-pound weights could convince a consumer more easily to jump on board, and they were easier to manufacture and sell than the full run of equipment and training needed for a full-time strongman. Sandow did rationalize this as a beginner routine that emphasized the importance of mind-muscle connection as an important first step before heavy lifting, and described the work as being plenty for the average person. So while many make the mistake of romanticizing his light dumbbell systems as some lost key of strength, forums can be found today with eager followers still putting the system to the test, the reality is that these systems were created around the logistical limitations of the day and sold to the lowest common denominator. They simply do not provide improved conditioning, size, strength, or even basic preparation compared to modern bodybuilding routines. The strongman of the Victorian era's real secret sauce came from the practice with heavy weights in preparation for their performances. With both bodyweight exercises and fixed strongman implements alike, scaling the exercises is not done easily. Bodyweight exercises and implements like fixed barbells, dumbbells, stones, sandbags, steel you might bend, or horses you might lift while upside down, usually come in 3 varieties: light, manageable, and challenge. While skill work with manageable weights is vital, many performers will find themselves spending each session exerting great effort with challenge weights, which are definitionally too damn heavy. In Sandow's book, Strength and How to Obtain It, under qualified instructors, heavy weightlifting may be pursued without the risk of danger. There are many other more specific directions, but they depend so much on individual requirements that it is not wise to put the rules on paper. A calisthenic athlete might take numerous failed attempts at a muscle-up, just as a young strongman might spend an entire session attempting to lap and load the heavy sandbag that is almost there. Given the number of skills to be mastered and the performance schedule demanded of these performers, there is no doubt that these too heavy challenge sessions would be all too frequent. So there's no way around it. The training of this era was grounded in frequent heavy practice repetitions with low reps, heavy weight, and a ton of effort. Now, the turn in physical culture that focused on aesthetics over performance came in 1893 when promoter Florence Ziegfeld displayed Sandow at the World's Columbian Expo in Chicago, only to find the audience was more astonished by his sinewy, muscular build than the weights Sandow was lifting, which prompted the incorporation of poses alongside his lifting in further shows. The fascination continued as Sandow gained fame. He was shown here in 1894 in a short film series from Thomas Edison Studios. In 1901, Sandow hosted the very first official bodybuilding contest in London. This wasn't just a niche novelty, but an event that attracted the attention of society as a whole. This first show was judged by Sir Charles Laws, an athlete and sculptor with 12 pieces featured in the Royal Academy of Arts, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote a few little-known pieces like The Lost World and Sherlock Holmes. So with the first physique contest, Sandow ushered in the Bronze Age of bodybuilding and secured his title as the founder of this movement. Now, while the creation of bodybuilding put a new focus on physique and influenced physical culture into a new direction, those changes didn't exist in a vacuum. Far from pure specialization, the training of Bronze Age figures still involved immense overlap with other sports and were influenced substantially by strongman, gymnastics, and what would eventually become Olympic-style weightlifting. So as we move into the Bronze Age of lifting, on the one end of the spectrum were muscular physiques that rejected the need for heavy weights. Charles Atlas is one of the most recognizable figures here, with the advertisements of his muscle-building system still resonating in the minds of every skinny weakling hoping to never get sand kicked in his face again. He promoted the dynamic tension system that involved squeezing and flexing the muscles through a range of motion as the hands pressed against each other without any equipment or resistance. If this smacks of Joel Seedman, it should. Atlas was a student of Bronze-era strongman Earl Lederman, and his physique was thusly built with weights. So like Sandow and Attila, bypassing the need for heavy equipment made it possible to sell a system that appealed to more people and required little overhead. It was the primitive version of buy my template. You would just think that a push-up or a lunge would have been present. Now, a more legitimate case against heavy weights was Polish performer Bobby Pandor, who at 160 pounds or a little over 70 kilos and 5'6", presented an astonishing physique that was born out of light dumbbells and gymnastics. It was claimed that he actually refused to lift heavy weights, except for his legs, where he would sprint stairs with his brother on his back. While lean and sinewy, Bobby was, of course, of slight muscular build, not as big as some of his other contemporaries. It should come as no surprise that he was overshadowed by the likes of George Hackenschmidt and Hermann Goernner, who, along with many others, were staunch proponents of heavy weightlifting. George Hackenschmidt was an Estonian wrestler and strongman born in 1878, about a decade younger than Sandow, and he impacted physical culture, sporting one of the biggest physiques of the era at 5'9" and 220 pounds or 100 kilos. He created the bench press and the hack squat lift variation. Prolific writer and mail order guru Earl Lederman wrote in his 1924 book, Muscle Building, Hackenschmidt was a rare exception in muscular development and strength, and I want to make it clear that no matter how diligently a person may work, there is not one athlete in 10,000 who could ever acquire Hackenschmidt's proportions and strength. So where we spend so much time discussing today unrealistic standards that get pushed by steroid users, as if we should only present standards or physiques that are attainable by the lowest common denominator, it was known over 100 years ago that results vary, and the best of the best are simply made of something different. George himself was an incredibly well-rounded man, speaking 7 languages, penning books on philosophy, and training as a cyclist and a gymnast in addition to a wrestler. From How to Live in 1908, it may be suggested that there is no reason why a man should go to the trouble and exertion of struggling with heavy weights, since there is no crying necessity for that particular man to acquire any phenomenal degree of strength. To that, I would reply by asking why a man should desire to be weak. He was endowed by his creator with muscles and sinews, which would enable him to cope successfully with such physical feats as he might be faced with during his earthly career. Today's field could do with more men cut from this cloth. Hackenschmidt's books outline the same wisdom that frustrates novices and natty lifters today: hard work, sleep, and nutrition. His training prescriptions gave what he thought were the most effective exercises, early compound barbell movements, along with ideal repetition ranges. As he said, some trainers recommend to their pupils for the training of all muscle groups one and the same light weights and believe they are able to obtain the same effect by frequent repetitions. My experience has taught me that this is wrong. For example, it is quite impossible to improve strong muscle groups, as for instance the hip muscles, with lightweight exercises. Earl Lederman mirrored this sentiment, saying, "I have often observed different individuals exercising in gymnasiums and wondered, while watching them perform light freehand movement, what physical goal they had set for themselves. Light calisthenic work has never developed huge muscles and never will. In order to succeed in exercising, the student must perform progressive work. I do not mean increasing the number of rep motions, I mean that the resistance you are working against must be made heavier as your muscles increase in strength. I'm a firm believer in performing exercises that tire the muscles within 10 repetitions." Hackenschmidt's most valuable insight was into his method for finding appropriate weight and increasing it over time. He encouraged lifters to find a 10 repetition max in each lift and start with 5 reps. Every week they were to increase 1 rep up to 10 reps and then repeat by adding 5 to 10 pounds and starting again at 5 reps. This was one of the earliest written descriptions of double progression, a method that, to many young lifters eager to get a handle on their training today, still seems cutting edge. Hackenschmidt recommended another method for explosive athletic movements like the 1 and 2 arm variations of snatches, cleans, jerks, and presses, where the reps needed to be lower. He encouraged doing 3 reps with a 10 rep max, adding a few pounds for 2, and then adding a few more pounds for 1 repetition to establish a record. As he said, it is quite sufficient to try records every 3 or 4 weeks, and in the meantime practice thoroughly exercises of endurance, and with light weights, try to still improve those muscles which you have found to be somewhat flabby. It is easy to find out at what point one is lacking. So way back in 1908, at the dawn of the Bronze Era, the importance of skill work, heavy weights over light weights, weak point isolation, and appropriately paced progressive overload was not just known by the greats, but featured front and center in their publications. Any discussion of George Hackenschmidt leads directly to the other Bronze Era giant, Hermann Goernner. Born in 1891, Goernner became a strongman in the 1920s after losing an eye in World War I. At 6'1" and weighing in the high 200-pound range, or over 120 kilos, with relatively low body fat, he represented a shift forward from the lean, grainy, sinewy types that came before him. Goerner's lifts are legendary today, in no small part to the loss of context over the years that has led to them being embellished. His only recognized deadlift record officially is a two-hand variation of 652, though he's often credited as having lifted over 800 pounds, but in an unspecified style. It's speculated that the unofficial weights that got around 800 pounds were done in a partial style, like this one-hand block deadlift variation. Regardless, his strength was renowned across the world, and he stood as one of the biggest men of the era, all before steroids existed. As a weightlifter and performer, his workouts were focused entirely on compound skill movements. Historian Terry Todd recounted a discussion with Charles Smith, who documented a week's workout from Goerner. He would train 5 days per week, a mix of cleans, snatches, deadlifts, presses, and curls, both one and two-hand variations, in a range of 1 to 5 reps. The protocol for each exercise was usually taking 6 to 10 sets to work up close to a limit before moving on to the next exercise. The lifters of the day had caught on to the consensus that big movements done for a lot of practice, progressed forward in weight, was the ticket to maximizing your size and physique, but experimentation was just beginning. Sigmund Klein was another innovator of the Bronze Era. In his New York City gym named Klein Studio Physical Culture, opened in 1929, the gym's tagline was, "Here we make men," and it was in these gyms that he pushed his Klein system. Sig preserved the focus on improving movement patterns over body parts and valued variety and athleticism. He combined heavy barbell movements with body weight and isolation exercises, often in long circuits, and in one example, deemed one of his favorites, he performed 23 different exercises in direct sequence, ranging from dumbbell and barbell movements to body weight and abdominal exercises. Most all were done for 10 to 15 reps without repeating exercises and without stopping. So let's take a pause to gain our bearings. Circus strongmen from the 1800s built physiques so impressive that it literally led to the creation of a separate sport to highlight them. Heavy weights, regular practice, and incremental increases in effort was the key, though the public received the 5-pound dumbbell for 100 reps variation, and through the writings of Hackenschmidt, Lederman, and others, this was codified through the early 1900s, the only primary change towards the end of the Bronze Era being the implementation of standardized plate-loaded barbells, the creation of early gym machines, and the elimination of less effective, awkward exercises in favor of more stable ones. Now let's jump forward several decades to see how Bronze Era tactics compare to those used at the peak of the Golden Era. This is the training program that Arnold used leading up to his 7 Mr. Olympia titles from 1970 to 1980. It is one that many have undoubtedly tried, only to be humbled by the immense workload. Arnold's double split 6-day per week workout had him working out twice a day, every day of the week except for one, using many exercises, high effort, and probably too many sets. Now we can guess what he was getting at. In an era where exercise science wasn't thoroughly developed, trial and error was the tool that made champions. Experimentation allowed each individual to find things that their body responded to, and one of the earliest discoveries many bodybuilders found was the dose-dependent relationship of certain training variables with results. For instance, if you were after a chest that didn't look like a man's chest, but a pigeon's or a barrel, you might start doing bench presses 5 sets of 10 once a week in some lackadaisical fashion. After some time though, you might find that applying more effort to the same scheme would cause a rapid growth spurt and increase muscle in the pectorals. So you decide that more effort equals more gains. If you perform the same protocol for many months, you might find that the gains slow down and you end up hitting a plateau. Having no more effort to give, you feel stuck and resolve to change something else. So now it's 8 sets of bench instead of 5, and once again you begin to grow. So you just learned that more working sets, or more volume, equals more gains. Having trained the chest for several months in this high volume, high effort fashion, gains once again slow down. This time you add an extra day, going to 2 times per week instead of 1. Again, you begin to make progress. So more frequency must mean more gains. Now you're on the warpath, putting every tool you have to work and chasing chesticle girthiness you never thought possible. Until, what else can I change, you ask yourself? Looking at the same movement you've been doing for the last 2 years, you say, aha, I need to shock the muscle with a new movement. Now bench press is followed up with dumbbells and flies, and after a few weeks, your chest meat is so heavy that you're having trouble breathing. So of course, more variation must equal more gains. So now you're a year into this experiment, much bigger than before, but tired of these frequent speed bumps, and in trying to come up with the master rules for lifting, you decide that just generally, more is better. More variation, more frequency, more effort. So while this is not even close to being a complete heuristic of how training works, it is a somewhat logical conclusion of a motivated lifter putting their body together from scratch. And this is exactly what Arnold's training was. Grueling workouts that involved vomit-inducing effort across many working sets with many different exercises multiple times per week. The only way he could physically fit all of this work into a week was to train twice a day, 6 days per week. This was obviously the program of a man possessed to win. Now there's something moving about the most motivated people doing whatever it takes to get their goal, even if the application was suboptimal. While the early strongman and bronze bodybuilders were certainly goal-oriented and engaged seriously with the discipline, the urgency to excel isn't quite as high in a sport with fewer participants. As participants and talent pushes the bar even higher, so too does the panic to keep up, and many radical transformations have been brought on by sheer desperation created by steeper competition. The Bulgarian system is a commonly cited example, as a small nation was able to produce Olympic champions against world superpowers by throwing out the complex periodized systems of the day that were meant to expertly balance stress and recovery, and just doing all the stress. The system had lifters max out several lifts 3 times per day, 6 days per week, and put a high premium on new PRs and absolute weight moved over technique. I wonder how any of this fits into Prilipin's chart. Much of the work was actually failed lifts, getting into dozens or hundreds of missed attempts per week. The brutal system had no grace or real intelligence behind it, other than knowing that the ones who didn't break under the stress of the system would thrive and become champions. The result was Bulgaria as a nation, with very few people having several gold medals against lifters from some of the biggest state-sponsored lifting programs in the world.
You're in Alcatraz. You're locked in a cell that's so short you can't even stand up on a bed you don't even fit on, right? It's all dark. And all your family and loved ones are in adjacent cells, and they're never allowed out of their cells. You have 30 days to squat a certain amount of weight, to put 100 pounds on your squat. Do you think you're going to train twice a week? And as soon as you ask people that question, how often would you train under these circumstances? Well, fuck, I would train every day. Well, why? Well, because I need to. Right.
Now, as inspiring as it might seem to follow the lead of people that just put their head down and went through the brick wall in front of them, optimal training principles are not set according to the breaking points of the most gifted and pharmaceutically enhanced specimens. If 3 people out of a population of 10,000 are able to tolerate and grow from something, there still has to be a plan for the other 9,997 that would fall apart. So we need to find the principles that are the rules, not the exception. So to find the list of rules that work best, we need to calibrate the system to ourselves, and to do that, we need to know which dials to turn. So here's a list of those important training variables that make up those dials that we can turn. We can't dig in more to the evolution of bodybuilding training until we understand the parameters, the dials you turn that yield a different result. Firstly, we have the equipment. Anything that loads the muscle has the potential to increase size and strength. That includes free weight barbells and dumbbells that have been used across every era of bodybuilding, more modern machines and cables that allow more precise stress with greater stability, and even the bodyweight exercises of Victorian era acrobats and modern day calisthenic athletes. Each type of equipment has its own application and limitation. For instance, you can't scale bodyweight exercises by 2.5 pound increments like you can on a barbell. You can't isolate small muscles away from others on a barbell like you can on a machine. And even though the advancement of equipment allowed for more training options, preferences still vary across every high performer of the sport today. For those who prioritized use of one particular piece of equipment to those who used a blend of them. After that, we have exercises. Each type of equipment has its own list, all of which can be arranged in numerous different ways. Some legendary physiques throughout history came from simple programs using only heavy weights on a barbell, where many modern mass monsters see the lack of surgical precision of a barbell as a pitfall and rely on many small isolation movements with machines that allow them to be more precise in their training. Then we get to how you actually do exercises. This is where things get complicated. The number of ways to do an exercise can include any of the following variables. Focus on the pump or increasing blood flow. Focus on the stretch. Focus on full range of motion. Focus on partials from the bottom, mid-range, or top end. Focus on speed. Focus on slow control. Focus on the eccentric. Focus on weight. Focus on mind muscle or being very strict. Focus on explosive efforts with plenty of cheating. Focus on time under tension, focus on mechanical tension, and the list goes on. Now consider how all of that can be arranged in a workout with short or long rest periods. Many exercises for the same muscle, or very few. Done to failure and beyond, or a few reps shy. Using any amount of reps from 1 to 100. And we aren't even to the workout split or training frequency. You have to ask, are you doing this once per week or more? Full body, push-pull legs, one muscle group per day? Is your head spinning? This is where I tell you to take a breath, because the really good news is that all of these have been applied with some success over the years. That means that there are a lot of ways to grow, and your success doesn't require walking a tightrope. So we're gonna figure this out. Now, the last and most important piece is progression. The first lesson that anybody should be exposed to is the one that can yield progress on imperfect programs, but without which there can be no progress. Progression means adding weight, increasing stress, and a fixation on that can absolutely carry your program, but you're not going to do anything if it's not present or you don't understand it, and this cuts to why your body grows in the first place. You experience a stress and your body adapts to render that stress less devastating. After you adapt to it, you can handle it again in stride without it just wrecking you. But that means that more gains can only come from more stress, which has to come in the form of more or different work or more weight. Exactly how you plan those improvements, selecting what increases, by how much, for how long, that's the job of a good program and what any expert trainer or lifter is going to be able to intuit. Progression can refer to a few things, like a new workout that you're not used to, say training a muscle twice per week as opposed to the one that you usually do, or performing 10 total sets instead of 5, or simply getting off the couch to do your first set of push-ups. But it also specifically refers to the methods you use workout to workout to keep stress going up once you've started, like the double progression method that was mentioned before. Many recognize progressive overload as being from Joe Weider's bodybuilding principles, a list of everything that popular culture knew about bodybuilding at the time of its writing in 1950. But its roots track back to the earliest lifters long before Weider ever came on the scene. As we consider these variables and how they contributed to Arnold's insane regimen, we have to move past the Bronze Age and consider Arnold's immediate influences, the first film legends and Muscle Beach icons who made up the Silver Era. Guys, if I can help fund this channel and help you solve a problem, I call that a win-win. So please allow me one moment to preach the good word of Boostcamp. I tend to get a little complex when I'm writing workout plans. Tracking progress for these programs is hugely important, but options were never great. I would write these long, complex progressions by hand into a notebook, or I would carry a binder filled with spreadsheets I printed off of LiftVault. That's why I'm here to introduce you to Boostcamp. Boostcamp is the easy way to track training progress directly from your phone. Their library of programs features countless dozens of powerlifting and hypertrophy-specific programs from your favorite creators, including Jeffrey Verity Schofield, Johnny Candido, Eric Helms, Greg Nuckols, Alberto Nunez, and of course, yours truly. Boostcamp also has exclusive programs that you just won't find anywhere else. Select the one best suited to your needs and watch the sets, reps, weights, and exercises populate automatically. Don't guess at that one weight you lifted that one time for how many reps again? Have your log of training with you at all times for easy reference in the convenience of your phone. Not only does Boostcamp have a stellar product, but their support is the only reason this channel exists. So thank you, the viewer, and thank you to Boostcamp. Check it out today. The link is in the description. Now, the Silver Era stands out for a few reasons, but one is that it encompasses the advent of steroids, which we have to talk about to contextualize all of the training decisions we're going to talk about moving forward. Testosterone was first synthesized in 1935 and was first commercially available in 1937. There are some murmurings on the internet that some people were still doping in that era, as scientists were first experimenting with hormone extracts from animal testicles. Aging scientist Charles Sicard took to injecting himself with a mix of blood, semen, and juice extracted from crushed animal testicles, claiming at 72 that he saw increases in vitality, strength, and sexual vigor, all signs of supplementing with testosterone. That buzz led to thousands of attempts at replicating the studies and the production of commercial elixirs. But alas, no results were replicated. It was later confirmed experimentally that the amount of test in these elixirs was 4 orders of magnitude less than what was needed for a biological effect. That's 10,000 times less. Eating and injecting the stuff in animal testicles is on par with eating kaiju horn to bump up your libido. Any results you experience are indeed placebo. So while there is some contention around who exactly were the last natural bodybuilders, it's clear that anything prior to 1937 was decidedly drug-free, and by the time the oral steroid Dianabol hit the streets in 1958, we could probably surmise that natural bodybuilding as the default was a thing of the past. But remember that access to information and materials was not as immediate as today. Disposable syringes weren't even mass-produced until 1954. Extra steps would have had to be taken to find a doctor and have them agree to administer shots regularly, and that assumes that they even knew at the time that it was as anabolic as we know now. And given that the Soviet sports team didn't adopt use until the 1950s, it seems unlikely that droves of recreational bodybuilders were ahead of one of the biggest sports systems of all time. Now, there's no doubt that increases in technology, from supplements to drugs to training equipment and training protocols, all had a major influence in the evolution of our idea of a peak human physique. But there is one element that's not talked about as often, which I believe is one of the biggest contributors to the changing physiques throughout this era. That is genetics. There's numerous genetic factors that affect how fast one gains muscle and how much they can potentially grow. Human traits tend to exist on a bell curve, meaning many have an average rank, with fewer people on either end of that curve having rankings that are very low or very high. Muscle growth can be influenced by countless genetic factors, from the durability of joints that can sustain rigorous strength training, the complex interplay of your hormonal profile, genes that limit myostatin, which is directly related to faster and greater muscle growth, and even the psychology that might commit someone to a lifetime of progressive overload with maximal effort, for fun. So it's no surprise that every study on the effects of resistance training shows the participants distributed across a bell curve. As you take the outliers from one particular domain, then select from that group the outliers for another, and then again, you end up with an extremely rare specimen who is engineered genetically across multiple domains to get the most out of training and show the greatest results. That's the Schwarzeneggers, the Yates, the Mentzers, the Colemans, the Heaths. These people are not genetically 1 in 10, they are 1 in 10,000. So just as Earl Lederman wrote about George Hackenschmidt's astonishing proportions back in the pre-steroid era of the early 1900s, no matter how diligently a person may work, there is not one athlete in 10,000 who could ever acquire Hackenschmidt's proportion and strength. Now, it's not enough to even talk about the effects of genetics on response to training. Even with actual response to steroids, the same bell curve exists, with hyper-responders gaining upwards of 50 pounds of muscle, but the less often talked about non-responders gaining hardly any. The fact that most of us are in the middle means that the average user is within a margin where use, while making obvious improvements to strength and muscularity, won't make up for poor or inconsistent training, and it certainly won't rocket the average person to being a 250-pound mass monster. The brutal truth is that even with steroids, it's still genetics. Now, this all matters because the changes in physiques over these eras have to be contextualized by the incredible rate of expansion of the sport that brought in more genetic talent, just as much of the use of drugs or the changing methods of training. Consider for a second the potential of Babe Ruth, who existed long before modern baseball, before there was a selection process that discovered the greatest talent and applied that over every country on the planet. Babe Ruth's best today probably wouldn't land him in the minor leagues. Understanding that in the silver era of lifting, where equipment was still somewhat limited and gyms harder to come by, where developing countries in South America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia had no need or time for recreational lifting, before pumping iron, before the Terminator, and before Mr. Olympia even existed. The number of people in the world lifting weights then compared to today was thousands of times fewer. In 2019, there was an estimated 41,000 health clubs in the United States, a country of 330 million people, and 27% of adults reported in engaging in some sort of resistance exercise. Compare that to a century ago, where the only way Charles Atlas could reach market penetration was by sending people via mail instructions for squeezing their arms together. This is the legacy of innovators and influencers like Sandow, Weider, and Schwarzenegger, and it's the reason that through the mid and late 20th century, the idea of what physique was physically possible for an elite bodybuilder seemed to change by the year. The silver era of bodybuilding was ushered in with the advent of the first major competition. Mr. America began in 1939 and Mr. Universe in 1948. It was in this period that the Weider brothers would make their mark by bringing equipment, training knowledge, and competitions into the modern era. The Weider brothers created the magazine Your Physique in 1940, which would later be renamed to Muscle and Fitness, which is still published today. They would found the Weider Barbell Co. in 1942, selling mail order equipment and supplements, and finally creating the IFBB in 1946, which would eventually host the first Mr. Olympia contest in 1965. Joe Weider secured his role as bodybuilding royalty by actively finding and recruiting bodybuilders to work under his brand, including at first Leroy Colbert, the first man with 21-inch arms, then an 18-year-old Dave Draper, and eventually, in 1968, the Austrian oak himself, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Still recited like gospel today are Joe Weider's famous principles for growth, a not-so-short list of tips and tactics that include how to organize training, such as planning your year into cycles and incorporating variety for confusion, as well as how to execute exercises, as in performing supersets, focusing on the pump, cheating reps, or using rest pause. Progressive overload is one of the most well-known tenets, and a new gym goer may think Weider himself invented it, but we can see easily that this was a staple since before the days of Sandow. Now let's evaluate the biggest faces of the Silver Era and see how they stack up against these principles. John Grimek, born 1920, stood 5'8" and 225 pounds, or just over 100 kilos, was a two-time Mr. America winner, 1940 and 41, 1948 Mr. Universe winner, and then Mr. USA in 1949. John Grimek was molded in the image of Bronze and Victorian era lifter. He was an Olympic weightlifter first, competing in the pre-drug era of the 1936 Olympics, as well as an athlete capable of gymnastic and balancing feats. John felt that his size was a direct product of his strength, pure and simple. He was known to do bent presses and other odd lifts, in addition to push presses, deadlifts, and squats, heavy in the 10 to 20 rep range with lots of effort. He had periods in the 1930s where most of his work was primarily Olympic work, and wrote a magazine article citing the clean and press as the single best exercise a man can do. He was a fan of variation, no surprise coming from a well-rounded athlete, and as a strength competitor, it's also no surprise he favored full-body workouts. He trained full body 5 to 6 days per week in his heyday, dropping to 3 times per week after his retirement. His often republished full-body workout involved a press, a row, a leg movement, an ab movement, and an arm exercise done for 3 sets of 10, 3 days per week. As John said, "I trained everything in every workout. I didn't do what they call split workouts and train legs and arms one day, back and other stuff the next day. The only way I ever isolated a group of muscles was when I finished with my routine for the day and I still thought I needed more for my back or chest or legs or whatever." John also championed the magic of squats, pushing a squat and bulk routine where breathing-style squats, done with 3 deep, hard breaths in between each rep, were done for very high reps, supersetted with a chest exercise, and this ran for up to 7 sets each. His advice to young lifters was the same: focus on the fundamentals that frustrate so many newbies looking for the secret. As he said, train consistently 2 to 3 days per week and add weight to the bar whenever possible and get lots of rest. Eat good food and drink plenty of water. When your entire career is a blur of hard, consistent work, advance forward over time using progressive overload, I can see how it's hard to single out what one fundamental thing is responsible for your success. Perhaps more famous than John Grimek were Steve Reeves and Reg Park, the 2 Hercules of the Silver Era. These 2 are probably the most identifiable figures of the Silver Era. They were born 2 years apart in 1926 and 28 respectively, and both had starring roles in Hercules movie franchises. Reeves worked with Cecil B. DeMille and eventually got a contract with Paramount that landed him 19 film roles between 1953 and 1968. Park was a South African bodybuilder that landed a role as the same heroic figure in Italian movies, and these movies were the ones that directly inspired Schwarzenegger. The Victorian era legacy that combined strength and physical development with art and performance continued. Now, Reg Park, at 6'1" and 250 pounds, or about 115 kilos at his heaviest, was a 3-time Mr. Universe in 51, 58, and 65, with Steve Reeves at a similar height and slightly lower weight, winning the title in 1950 and Mr. America before that in 47. In a 1953 issue of Muscle Builder, which was a rename of Weider's Your Physique before it got its current title, Steve Reeves wrote an article titled "My Favorite Exercise Course." He talked about the need for individuals to address their specific needs and advocated finding exercises you like, reasoning that the lifter will train harder. Exercise, he says, is meant to be enjoyed, not endured. He arranged his training by doing 3 exercises per muscle group, 1 set of each, training the entire body with a mix of barbell and dumbbell exercises in one single session. He had a very simple method of double progression where he would start with a weight that allowed a hard set of 8 and continue each session until he could do 12, then add weight and repeat, starting at 8 again. In this way, each workout was simple, the weights were set, and he just had to chase records in every exercise and every workout. Reg Park's methods were not entirely different, as his posted workouts involved similar heavy barbell exercises performed in whole body fashion. The primary standout is that he often did 3 to 4 sets of 8 to 10 in each exercise instead of 1, and was known for his 5x5 approach where 2 warm-up sets were followed by 3 hard sets of 5 with the exact same weight. There also was a special emphasis on strength. In his publication Train for Power, he advocated for max single deadlifts and finishing up curls with overloaded sheet reps, and squats with overloaded half and quarter squats. Is it an accident that a man who trained with heavier loads and with 2 to 3 times the volume of Steve Reeves stood 20 to 30 pounds heavier? We can only speculate. In contrast to Reg's weight-focused approach was Vince Gironda, who was born in November 1917. If Reg's heavy 5x5 was a hammer, Vince Gironda's methods were a scalpel. Vince was a Hollywood stuntman who stood at an aerodynamic 5'8", 185 pounds, or about 85 kilos, and was known for his strong and very idiosyncratic views on training. He was known for despising squats and throwing a student out for doing sit-ups and leg raises. His rationale was that those movements increased thickness of the glutes and midsection, which was not a desirable aesthetic trait. Vince preferred sissy squats for legs and guillotine benches to the neck for chest. He was a master of exercise execution and favored variation of perfectly selected movements with many sets. He rejected the chasing of sheer pig weight for the perfect execution of slow, tense reps over a full range of motion. Now, this seemed to mirror the 5-pound dumbbell approach of Attila and Sandow and the dynamic tension method of Charles Atlas. Except now, machines and plate-loadable bars and dumbbells allowed this focused tension to be loaded and progressed. This would be the start of some of the most commonly talked about bodybuilding axioms around establishing a mind-muscle connection and working towards a burn or a pump that still persists today. However, there is still contention over the value of heavy, progressive power training and small, focused isolation work. While most bodybuilders incorporate some mix of both, there are still advocates for focusing on one side of the spectrum at the expense of the other. An example beginner routine from Gironda had the trainee lift 6 days per week using isolation movements, starting with 1 set and increasing by 1, changing exercises monthly and adding weight every 3 workouts. He's also known for his 8x8 approach, where 8 sets of 8 reps were performed with around a 15 rep max using 30 to 45 seconds rest. This was done for each body part in an upper-lower split, where each day might have 5 exercises, and that was on a 5-day schedule. Holy volume, Batman. Next, we have legend Bill Pearl, born in 1930. He stood 5'10", 242 pounds, or 110 kilos. The 4-time Mr. Universe had a high-volume approach that favored, like Gironda, variety and rotation of exercises to avoid stagnation. 8 to 12 reps per exercise was normal, as it had been for so long and continues to be, and this was done on a whole body or upper-lower body split with 4 to 5 sets per exercise, totaling up to 50 sets in some workouts. One of Bill's biggest appeals to lifters was to not train to failure. According to Bill Pearl, if you don't leave the gym with the feeling of having something in reserve, you will sooner or later reach a point where your training begins to seem so hellish and burdensome, you will either start missing workouts or stop training altogether. And then where is your progress? Now, so far, we haven't really seen a specific appeal to train to failure, or even a real definition of what that means. We can assume that missed lifts were common in training where strength was the focus, especially before there were percentage-based periodization programs or a concept of RPE that corralled in lifters. If progressing weight was where the growth occurred, which had been the rule since the first strongmen, then it just stands to reason that training to the brink and beyond was par for the course. Bill Pearl's wisdom makes much more sense in the context of such high volume. When one trains to the limit, fatigue causes weight to drop almost immediately, which means that the stress of each successive set comes from the metabolic fatigue rather than the exposure to very heavy weights. So by leaving a rep in the tank, the total number of heavy reps is much higher. You can use more weight across more sets, even if the outright blunt trauma of the last all-out rep in each set is absent. I call this the cruising altitude of volume, and it's how I structure volume work. By keeping effort down just a little bit, you can use much more weight, and the overall amount of weight lifted across all of your sets is much heavier. And it's especially useful around strength movements where there is a strict standard for technical execution, and you can't let it just fall apart for the sake of effort. It also addresses the problem of hitting the brick wall, which happens so easily when all you know is maximal effort. The sheer volume is an effective training stress by itself. The dose-dependent relationship of volume and muscle growth is pretty well established, but the small gap of effort that you leave can be used for a short period of time. In short, there's more options for progressing if you have those reps left in the tank. Progressive overload is still key. It just hinges on your perception of the weight changing rather than your absolute performance. As Bill Pearl says, as your strength improves, the poundages you've been using will feel easy. Whenever you reach that point, increase the poundage until the last rep is difficult again. Now, one of the biggest silver era icons was Leroy Colbert, who was likely the person responsible for creating our fascination with large arms. He was one of the first people in Weider's employ, and he was credited as the first man to get 21-inch arms. He is another testament to the power of high volume training. Colbert was born in 1933 New York, and the story goes that him training along with Marvin Eder 3 times per week used a template of 3 sets of 8 to 10 reps. Now, both of them being very competitive and eager to grow, decided to fill up their workout with more work. They moved all the way up to 10 sets, which resulted in Leroy's status as being the first man with 21-inch arms. This is also where we start to see obvious differences in training, because it's worth noting that Leroy was in direct opposition of Gironda's obsessive precision of movement execution. He focused on continuous movement rather than slow and controlled reps that kept tension on the muscle. He was focused on weight, clipping off reps, and adding more sets. So looking at the size of those who prioritize heavy weights with loose form over many sets, you might see a pattern of bigness starting to emerge. And as we see people gravitate towards different methodologies, this becomes more clouded by the reality of genetics. It's been argued that those with the best genetics, as with those who take steroids, can recover better from grueling high-volume workouts that might not work so well for other people. Natties with ho-hum genes just simply can't tolerate these high-volume ball-busting workouts. But it has similarly been argued that slow gainers actually need more work. One analogy that was used by the likes of Josh Bryant says that just like the slow kid in class has to study more, slow gainers need more stimulus to match the amount of growth from their fast gainer counterparts. This is shown in the monster work ethics of some natty lifters of today, including Jeffrey Verity Schofield, who uses high volume with just an insane amount of effort. This image is a 12-year-old Leroy in 1945, the decade before the Soviets began using testosterone. This is, by any rational estimation, a completely natural 12-year-old. The theme of genetic talent showing itself early is only going to become more obvious as we move forward into the modern era. Pictures and footage of future champions as teenagers in their first year of training abound, looking more developed than some enhanced 15-year veterans. So, are genetics like Leroy's or the use of steroids what allows such high-volume routines to give results? Or can we say that the drug use and genetics of high-intensity gurus like Mike Mentzer and Dorian Yates, shown here in their first years of training, allowed them to grow without doing nearly as much work? We can only speculate. And as we dip into the golden age of bodybuilding, where the creation of the oral steroid Dianabol, along with an exponential growth in genetic talent, reshaped the scene, the confusion is only going to get worse. This brings us to our primary focus of this piece. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Austrian oak born in Austria in 1947, became California governor from 2003 to 2011, star of movies and films, and yes, Mr. Olympia 7 times. As a young man, he was inspired directly by Reg Park's portrayal of Hercules, and Reg would eventually become a direct friend and mentor. Teenage Arnold competed in powerlifting and Olympic lifting between 1963 and 1968, again preserving the bridge between strength and physique culture. This imprinted on his training along with Reg's mentorship, as Arnold favored heavy barbell lifts, including ones that are less used today, such as cleans and high pulls. Arnold was a big advocate of squats, but his legs were arguably his weakest link. Is this an argument against squats as a primary builder, or is it that the defined muscular development from broad movement patterns differs significantly from person to person? We can only speculate. Now, that early influence of heavy lifters like Park and his time spent training for strength in competitions would be married with more modern specialized methods, as Joe Weider recruited Arnold and took him to the US at 21 years old in 1968. There, Arnold would train and, like so many of his peers, adopt much of the influence of Weider's principles. Simple ones like progressive overload, sure, but more complex and specialized approaches would pop up in Arnold's training as well. He used many sets reminiscent of Bill Pearl's grueling schedule, but instead of leaving some in the tank, he would include advanced fatigue techniques like supersets, pre-fatigue, rest pause, and of course training specifically for the pump to take his sets to and beyond failure. Arnold also used more advanced programming maneuvers like blending heavy and light weights. He would shock the muscle with variation to prevent stagnation, and he would plan and cycle through different blocks of training throughout the year. Now, this last one is a less often talked about feature of bodybuilding training, but one that has to be present for any long-term competitive career to be successful. See, competitive athletes have different demands throughout the season, and training has to adjust around those different time periods. 10 weeks out from a show, dropping body fat is the primary concern, and muscle growth is going to be limited. Whereas 8 months out, immense gains can be made by staying in a caloric surplus and letting body fat climb a little bit. This is generally what we know as bulking and cutting cycles. Cycling the volume and intensity and structure of your training allows you to meet the demands of each phase, while also preventing burnout or stagnation from just staying in the same exact mind-numbingly brutal training split day in, day out. Simply put, if you do the optimal thing for growth year-round, it is no longer optimal. Now, we can see in the program that Arnold laid out that his entire plan was broken into 4 parts, along with each change he made and why. He would drop work immediately after the Olympia to recover, would start to pick it up with a gentle amount of volume, and then would taper up the amount of work into the last 12-week blitz that was his Olympia prep. This breaking of training into dedicated periods is referred to directly as periodization and reflects exactly what the Soviets were working on in the 1950s with their Olympic sports team. The attempt to give a predictably effective structure to all of sports led to innovations in training that are still used today across the board, including powerlifting and Olympic lifting. And bodybuilding, though they don't talk about it as much, still benefits from such an approach. Now, bodybuilding doesn't involve the number of variables that, say, football or baseball does, where strength, power, conditioning, coordination, and game strategy all have to be developed and peaked for one singular game. But periodization does address the fact that in strength sports and bodybuilding, the same exercises, reps, and structure leads to diminished returns. So what is most effective is not just a byproduct of genetics or drug use, or how supremely effective the protocol is in a vacuum by itself, but it's also based on the most recent thing that you actually adapted to. The same stress doesn't do the same thing across your entire training life. Now, this is the primary reason the shock principle exists to begin with, as a way to introduce something new that you aren't acclimated to, and it's the reason that different training phases can be so useful. You have to train the same thing long enough to show progress, which might be 4 weeks, it might be 4 months, but too long on the same thing and your progress comes to a screeching halt. This perspective can also give some clarity, as many bodybuilders make the mistake of thinking about training as what happens today in the gym, and any discussion of what methods are effective don't go beyond that into the week or the month. So when Mike Mentzer, a sharp critic of Arnold's high training volume, asked if 5 sets are better, then why not 100? He was treating volume like bodybuilders treat all training variables, as something that is meant to be set in stone at some optimal level and left alone, not something that is meant to be turned up and down over the course of a training year to get a desired result. Very extreme workout protocols can yield great results, but aren't sustainable long term, which is exactly why Arnold only did a 6-day per week double split for the prep leading into the Mr. Olympia. The amount of work was changed throughout the year based on what was needed to grow and how long it could be sustained for, and that cuts to the core of programming for all of sports, and it makes up most of the training decisions that are going to be present in any sufficiently good training program. This brings us to the controversy of high intensity versus high volume training, which pits those who believe anything more than 1 set to failure is a waste of time against, well, everybody else. Arthur Jones, inventor of Nautilus machines and all-around eccentric, is known for coining high-intensity training as a term in training protocol and using it to market his new line of Nautilus equipment.
There was one man in the right place and at the right time. He created an exercise formula and turned it into a $300 million empire. Arthur Jones.
He sold it as an alternative to the 2-hour marathons so common in bodybuilding, not only suggesting that 1 set performed to failure was adequate for growth, but that it was actually superior. In a separate video, I chronicle the details of Arthur's infamous Colorado experiment, where he spiked what was supposed to be an academic study so he could claim that his methods caused Casey Viator to gain 63 pounds of muscle in 28 days. And yes, there are still some people that repeat that number to this day. This reminds me of Sandow and Charles Atlas with their cheap mail order systems. No one is buying the workout that requires skill with clunky metal equipment and hours of work a day, but if you tell them they can get it in 1 set in a gym filled with idiot-proof equipment, the sky's the limit. Arthur was nothing if not a brilliant marketer, It worked, and it worked well, and it was another step in him becoming one of the wealthiest men in his day. Now, Mike Mentzer was a talented young bodybuilder who was influenced by Casey Viator, and he ended up working for Jones himself. Mike switched to those methods on his short competitive run in the late 70s and wrote about his own take on high intensity in his books Heavy Duty 1 and 2, published in 1993 and 1996 respectively. This method has been adopted by a handful of bodybuilders over the years, most notably Dorian Yates when he became one of the first true mass monsters of the modern era, and then more recently Jordan Peters, who looks like Dorian Yates ate Dorian Yates. The main idea of high intensity is that a sufficient amount of effort on a single set done to failure can trigger a growth response, and that by stopping the workout and focusing on recovery, growth is then maximized. HIIT advocates say that the extra volume doesn't correlate with growth, but actually creates more breakdown and makes recovery take longer. Limited growth from overtraining is absolutely a thing. You can push it too hard where your body doesn't grow in response, but this really is a hard nut to crack. These athletes had developed massive amounts of muscle over many years and developed a resistance to growth as a result. The simple fact of having that excessive muscle tissue is the body's attempt at rendering training stress, namely weight and volume, completely inert. What bodybuilders back in the day likely experienced was a slowing of gains as they trained throughout their career, and in an effort to stay competitive in an ever-expanding sport, realized that clocking more time and effort resulted in noticeable growth. The state of golden era bodybuilding training can be defined as much work as possible, with many repeating sets over many exercises, often leading to north of 30 or 40 total sets per workout, and this led to many of the best physiques in the history of the sport. Here's a short run of Arnold's contemporaries in the golden era who used generally high amounts of work. You have Franco Columbu, Arnold's often training partner and lifelong friend. The Italian bodybuilder's methods were cut from the same cloth as Arnold. His advanced chest routine featured 7 sets of bench, pyramiding up to heavy reps, followed by 4 sets each of 4 other exercises in the 8 to 10 rep range. The emphasis on weight is no doubt a factor that led to Franco's physique, but also the strength that made him an early World's Strongest Man competitor along with Lou Ferrigno. Now, Ferrigno, otherwise known as the Incredible Hulk, stood 6'5" and 315 pounds, or about 135 kilos in the offseason. He was portrayed as Arnold's rival in pumping iron, which is funny considering that Lou cites Steve Reeves' version of Hercules as his primary inspiration in opposition to Arnold's motivation by Reg Park's version. And I guess films were short on strong representation because Ferrigno would take on the role himself in a 1983 reimagining. Lou preferred to train each muscle group once per week. To maximize work in one session, he would do upwards of 10 exercises depending on the day, each for 4 to 5 sets of 8 to 10 reps. Sergio Oliva, born in 1941, was another transfer from Olympic lifting, having competed in the 1962 Games at 198 pounds or 90 kilos for Cuba. He gained political asylum in the US and became one of the greats of his era, winning the Olympia in 1967 and 68. His training was similarly high volume. 2 of the workouts that he used followed this scheme: pyramiding up over 10 sets of bench while supersetting chin variations, 10 sets of behind the neck superset with dips, and 5 sets of supersets for shoulders, arms, and rows, every single set 10 to 15 reps. There were 2 separate arm days with similar work, and funnily enough, only 6 sets of squats for all of the leg work in his week. It looks like the former Olympic lifter had had his fill of squats, but you can draw an easy correlation between the amount of upper body work specifically for the arms and Sergio's impressive and groundbreaking physique. And then lastly, you have Frank Zane, who is known for his narrower physique that prioritized aesthetics over mass. Zane preferred a push-pull leg split, ran with 1 day off, meaning he would repeat each workout every 4 days. 3 sets of 12, 10, 8 with short rest was the norm, focusing on stretching and the pump. While less substantial than the marathon workouts of his contemporaries, it would still amount to quite a bit of volume over his claimed 75-minute workout times. And oh yeah, I forgot, you can't talk about a lot of training work in the golden era without mentioning Tom Platz, who is a legend, not just for the biggest quads anybody has ever seen ever, but for his absolutely brutal approach to training. He was born in 1955, started competing in the early 70s, right at the midpoint of the golden era, and has earned legendary status for his just insane unhinged training protocols. The workouts retained the big movements and high volume that everybody else was doing, but turned the effort up to 10 and then kept turning it. He engaged in these murderous workouts with 5 to 10 sets of high rep protocols over multiple exercises per muscle group. Now, this is difficult for upper body, but for the legs, if you do it to the limit, it's torturous, and Tom did it to the limit, and his willingness to suffer led to the biggest legs in the game. Now, if you take all of this information over all of these golden era figures, all of it can be taken to several different conclusions. You can interpret it as volume being generally better, since all studies show a dose-dependent relationship where more work tends to trend with more gains to a point, or you can interpret it as superior genetics along with steroids that allows otherwise crippling amounts of work to be done, where only the best can get away with this, and even then it's maybe not ideal. You could also acknowledge the lifetime of training of the average bodybuilder, where acquiring superhuman amounts of muscle required ever more work and effort to convince the body to hold just a few more pounds of lean tissue. You can consider how this effect varies over time. You can consider the individual genetic variation that might make one method preferable to one person over another. Any one of these conclusions seems rational, but again, we can only speculate. Now, the high-intensity crowd argues that it was only because of steroids that they could recover from the incredible workload to begin with, and that natural lifters are better suited with high intensity. But there's a problem with this. HIIT's biggest names, Yates, Mentzer, Viator, Peters, were all aggressive steroid users, and the same property that would make a steroid user survive brutally high volume would also allow that person to get away with less work and still grow. It both lowers the minimum effective volume you need to grow and raises your maximum recoverable volume. So basically, more things work. Add in the obvious genetic gifts and it makes the picture even more fuzzy. Here's Arnold at 16 years old, genetically predispositioned to be a great bodybuilder. It's obvious in his earliest pictures. But here's Yates after only 9 months of training. And here's Mentzer at 18 years old in his very first bodybuilding show. Both Yates and Mentzer were using traditional volume methods at the time these pictures were taken. And both of them were further along the curve than some people with 10 years under their belt. With very little time spent training, it was obvious that these two would go far with any amount of time and discipline. And again, whether you want to argue that they got good because of their methods or in spite of it, because of the genes, because of the steroids, or in spite of it, all seems to be a matter of bias. Now, of special interest is Mike Mentzer, whose entire bodybuilding competitive career was incredibly short. His first show was in 1970 at 18 years old, and at 195 pounds, he showed the promise of a great bodybuilder. In 1971, just a year or two later, he injured his shoulder and stopped training until 1975. He then picked training back up and had a quick run of success until his last show at the Mr. Olympia in 1980. Now, I know Mike Mentzer at his last show in 1980 looked like a 45-year-old 70s adult film star, but he was actually only 28 years old in this appearance. The story goes that Arnold came back from time away and took the win in a very controversial decision. Mentzer ended up placing 5th. Mentzer, who was so dejected, not only threw his trophy in the trash, but gave up bodybuilding as well as lifting altogether and proceeded to atrophy and get overweight. Now, understanding the difficulty of a hard loss, it's hard for me to sympathize with Mentzer at all. He dropped out of med school in a bid to become a psychiatrist after 3 years. Within his first year of competing in bodybuilding, he stopped training for 4 years. And within his comeback and subsequent 5-year meteoric run to the top, where he became a supposed heir to the Olympia throne, one hard loss caused him to not just give up competing, but lifting altogether. His books Heavy Duty 1 and 2 were published in the mid-90s, in 1993 and 96, when Mike was in the throes of heavy amphetamine use and depending on young bodybuilders to live with him and pay his rent. Meanwhile, his primary rival Arnold had secured his legacy as one of the best ever and was coming off a decade of action blockbusters, including 1991's Terminator 2, which is one of James Cameron's masterpieces and Arnold's most iconic role. Now, this isn't just to put Mentzer's name in the mud. He was intelligent, a promising writer, and slated to be one of the next great competitors. But his personality was that of a self-saboteur, and it makes him somewhat of a cautionary tale. He's a person whose unwillingness to commit and finish what he started cost him what he could have been. His inconsistent track record is a stark juxtaposition to the story of Arnold, whose own obvious flaws exist right next to his legacy, which is that of a man who set impossibly high goals and stopped at nothing to get them. Mike had a combined 6 years of active competition, only 5 of which were as an established adult, and his legacy were 2 books overstuffed with philosophy and personal thoughts that claimed to know the one true method of training, one set to failure as a fixed rule, which was in specific opposition to Arnold, along with every other bodybuilder of the era. Even his books fell short of Arnold's, with the first heavy duty clocking in at an embarrassing 67 pages compared to Arnold's exhaustive Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding at over 700 pages. I understand that heavy duty was written entirely by Mike, but still, it is the commitment to doing something great and forming a team and delegating responsibility that led to one of the most seminal pieces of bodybuilding of all time that most newbies still benefit from using today. That did not come from the guy that was known for giving up before he finished what he set out to do. Now, you cannot, of course, relate personality traits or book lengths to training efficacy, but given the tortured history of Mike Mentzer, there is a poetic irony to his claim that the problem with modern bodybuilding was simply people doing too much work. With statements about this thing being better than that thing, there are few firm statements that we can make, and opinions are really far from conclusive, but where I'm convinced of HIIT's lack of superiority, not to say it's not effective in the first place, is simply the fact that it prohibits the use of volume at any given time. It's a foolish and one-dimensional way to treat training variables, which are meant to be changed by need. Volume is a dial that can be turned up or down at any given time to manipulate stress and manage recovery. It's another tool to get a desired result, and you can't use it in an exclusively low-volume system. Single methods don't retain their perfect growth-stimulating capabilities because your very adaptation to them makes them less effective. Your perfect approach depends heavily on the last thing you adapted to, and any stalled out HIIT follower will begin to grow quickly simply by adding in a few extra sets, even if only for a temporary period of time. And as we move past the golden age, we move into the age of dynasties from 1984 to 2005. That 20-year period of bodybuilding would be dominated by three men, each one of which moved the goalpost further and further and put the pressure on everybody else to keep up. This is what would become the age of mass monsters. To start, we have Lee Haney, who became the next quantum step forward in bodybuilding, so much so that the Haney era is often used to describe his run post-Golden Era. Haney won 8 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles, beating Arnold's record of 7, sporting thicker legs and shoulders than Arnold, but with a similarly small waist. At 5'11" and 230 pounds, or 105 kilos, and low body fat, we were beginning to see what true conditioning looked like. Lee Haney was a different animal than the similarly weighted Steve Reeves or Reg Park. He was shorter, sure, but the difference between 10 and 12% body fat that Reeves and Reg sported and the 5% or less body fatted of Haney was the difference of 12 to 15 pounds of pure muscle tissue, meaning at the same weight you have a dramatically different physique. The Haney era concluded with the rise of Dorian Yates, who won 6 consecutive Olympia titles between 1992 and 1997. If Haney was a step forward in the sport, Dorian was a full jump with a running start. At 5'9", he stepped on stage at 260 pounds or 120 kilograms. Now, we've covered 260-pound bodybuilders before, but Goernner had a body fat well into the 20% range, and Ferrigno was 6'5". That similar amount of weight on a smaller frame with an enhanced element of conditioning meant that there was just a bigger human being on stage than we had ever seen before. Now, Dorian was a late starter, picking up the sport at 21, and within 9 months looked better than many 10-year veterans. He would grow to proportions the sport had never seen. And Pandora's box had been opened. At this point, it just couldn't be shut. Now, it's important to point out that just like testosterone and Dianabol changed the face of the silver and golden era, this modern jump in size was also helped along by the use of growth hormone and insulin through the 1980s and 90s, in addition to the continued use of oral and injectable steroids. The surge in sizes led to thicker waists and bloated bellies, and that's a controversial swing in the sport that has only recently started to reverse. As we move into the 90s, we have who is still argued to be the greatest of all time, and that is Ronnie Coleman. The reign of Dorian led immediately to Ronnie with his amazing size, standing on stage at a ridiculous 300 pounds at under 6 feet of height. And he was only slightly taller than Dorian. At a body fat under 5%, his physique looked more like that of a racehorse. Now, Ronnie Coleman was one of the few bodybuilders to actually have a day job, and footage of Ronnie in full contest prep, scarfing down plain chicken breast by the pound while working as a police officer in uniform, still just, it brings a smile to my face. Ronnie's size was unmatched, even by the other mutants of his day who were desperate to keep up to try to claim the Olympia title. Ronnie had 8 consecutive wins from 98 to 2005, which meant every time he showed up, he beat the likes of Kevin Levrone, Dennis James, Marcus Rule, Nasser El Sambadi, Gunter Schlierkamp, and eventual 4-time Olympia winner Jay Cutler. As of 2005, every single Olympia winner since 1984 was either Lee Haney, Dorian Yates, or Ronnie Coleman. Now, to compare the dynasty training methods, starting with Lee Haney, his training wasn't groundbreaking from the previous generations we've covered, but he had some idiosyncrasies himself. Using 3 to 5 sets of 6 to 15 reps, he would work muscle groups twice per week, further splitting them into AM and PM sessions for 4 distinct workouts. This allowed greater effort for more of the work, which fit Lee's specific focus on getting as much out of each set as possible. Where so many preach the importance of strict control, Lee was unashamed to claim that effort took precedent. Absolute failure is more important than all the technique in the world, according to Lee. Now, he preferred to stay with movements he liked instead of opting for constant rotation, so instead he varied the rep ranges to keep things fresh. He conceptualized weight into the model of mass and sculpting. It was thought that heavy weight and low reps was important for building raw mass, and that higher reps somehow provided a shaping or sculpting effect. This superstition wasn't new, as the experience of high rep pump workouts is entirely different than power workouts, including the way the muscles look after. So it kind of stood to reason that adaptations within the muscle might be different too. However, we know now that all muscle growth is essentially the same, and while different movements can have some impact on where the tissue is grown within a muscle, the rep ranges do not. Muscle gained with low reps is not structurally different than muscle gained with high reps, and the current thinking is that 3 to 30 reps is similarly effective at building muscle. That assumes that each set is taken relatively close to failure. Now, despite this, Haney's approach was not any less viable. Alternating heavy and light days was an example of DUP, which is a commonly used tactic when training muscles or movements twice per week, and is indeed correlated with improved results. Daily undulating periodization just simply means you're working different rep thresholds on different days, and it provides an element of variety that allows you to continue training at a high frequency. Heavy weight has an added benefit in that it does train the nervous system, which means that muscles gained with 3s or 5s comes along with greater strength. If heavy workouts are useful for getting big and the strength that comes with it allows bigger training efforts, causing more growth in turn, then one would want to lift heavy all the time. But as so many lifters find out, this is not sustainable. In addition to risk of injury or overuse issues, frequent heavy workouts are hard to recover from, and the efforts are not predictable, which means it's difficult to continuously set PRs. But if you use a lighter day that focuses on metabolic fatigue from driving blood into the muscle can be grown and the joints are generally happier for it. It is a very useful strategy. Now, moving on to Dorian, known for his high-intensity approaches that were somewhat similar to Mentzer's. He posted his workouts during his formative years from 1982 to 85 when he first started lifting, and it took him from this to this. Dorian used a 2-day split, averaging 3 exercises for bigger muscles and 2 for smaller ones, taking the sets to failure and adding weight if they exceeded 8 reps. So his efforts were notably heavier, as he was often training below 8 reps, and that might have contributed to his run of injuries late in his career. However, he was also following up that heavy work with continued post-failure work, getting into much later rep ranges. So it was almost the consolidation of heavy and light work into one set. Now, Dorian claims that after a year he employed forced reps, suggesting that post-failure techniques were eventually necessary or otherwise a good idea after an introductory period, but in the beginning, as he was a newbie, not so much. So that's a sign to you guys that are just starting out, you don't necessarily need to start with 21s and forced reps and drop sets. Just simple progression is good enough in the beginning. Now, notable to Dorian was his infrequent approach. Those who train muscle groups once per week typically do an immense amount of work, and those who do less work usually train a muscle group 2 to 3 times per week. Dorian was in the middle, rejecting splits that went off a 7-day week. He would average a muscle group 3 times every 2 weeks for a 1.5 times frequency. Now, it's been suggested that Dorian trained with more volume than he let on, where most people fixate on the 1 set to failure. His training actually included several warm-up sets for higher reps. He wouldn't count them as work because I'm sure they didn't feel like work compared to the actual sets, but fatigue and total accumulated reps still do play a role in volume and growth. It is not negligible. Volume is not just the work that is done to the absolute limit. Now, how much of a role it plays is unclear, and it's often debated. Now, looking at his recommendations from his Blood and Guts book, he specifically says that he chose more work for bigger muscle groups. This is another bodybuilding paradox, as one might think a bigger muscle needs more work to grow, but others point out that bigger muscles can put out so much work that they take much longer to recover. So which is it? Do smaller muscle groups get more work throughout the week because they're smaller and bounce back faster? Or do they get less by virtue of being smaller and not needing as much work? Dorian specifically says 5 exercises for a big muscle like back and 2 exercises for a smaller muscle like biceps, each with several warm-ups and 2 all-out working sets, in opposition to Mike Mentzer's 1. It is worth pointing out that Dorian was known for having one of the thickest, biggest backs in the game, yet biceps were often considered a weakness of his. The volume certainly correlates with his results, but is there a causal effect? Was the difference in volume responsible for the difference? We can only speculate. While Dorian's training is nowhere near the volume of those who would do 7 movements for 20 plus total sets per muscle group, his higher rep warm-ups, followed by 2 balls out, 2 and beyond failure sets, don't look quite as low volume as most people think, and it's reasonable to think it had some role in his freakishly big physique when you compare his work to something promoted by Mentzer or Arthur Jones. In fact, Mike Mentzer was even known for trying to convince Dorian that he should be doing less work, which is a weird thing to suggest to somebody whose physique literally changed the face of bodybuilding over a several-year period. And then lastly, in the Dynasty era, we have Ronnie Coleman, who competed in powerlifting before bodybuilding and thusly was no stranger to heavy-ass barbell work. Where Dorian preferred the precision and control allowed with machines, dumbbells, and cables, Ronnie was perfectly comfortable moving maximal loads as he was doing barn-burning, high-rep, high-fatigue sets. He was known for benching 500 pounds for reps, squatting and deadlifting over 800 pounds, and throwing around the 200-pound dumbbells. In his immortal words,
everybody want to be a bodybuilder, but don't nobody want to lift no heavy-ass weight.
Ronnie seemed to be a throwback to Lee Haney, prioritizing fluid, explosive reps with a minimally controlled negative and a specific focus on explosive effort on the way up, more so than strict control. In the opinion of Justin Harris, this is actually an optimal approach.
I think the best training is essentially what Ronnie Coleman did, which if you watch the way he trained, it was bad form. We talked about this yesterday too. Bad form because he never locked out and he lifted explosively. But it appears, and there's some data to correlate with this, it appears that explosive concentric motion, not a lot of worry about the eccentric other than avoiding injury, and then constant tension on the muscle, which is how he trained. You watch him do like shoulder press, it's this.
Mm-hmm. While it is far from conclusive, it has been pointed out that Ronnie didn't suffer joint issues throughout his career, except for the back incident that led to a botched surgery that left him disabled now. But Dorian, on the other hand, had his career ended by injuries from the work he was doing with low volume and with machines, which theoretically should be easier on the joints. So one can ask, did the fluid, explosive style of Ronnie Coleman actually save his elbows, knees, and shoulders? Or is it the result of other factors like genetics and what we observe is purely coincidental? We can only speculate. Now, Ronnie's routine pushed volume to the limit, performing a push-pull leg split twice per week, each workout lasting 2 hours and going upwards of 40 sets. Having started training as a powerlifter, Ronnie's preference was for heavy-ass free weights over machines. When you consider the extra taxation to the rest of the body that comes with things like bent rows, squats, and deadlifts, and you pair that with all of the work that has to be done, the immense, grueling effort with short rest periods, it really makes the work that Ronnie did all the more impressive. Could Ronnie recover from these workouts because of his years training with them, like adapting over time to that type of grueling prescription? Or did he have some innate ability to recover that allowed him to grow from that in the first place? Even if you credit his recoverability to massive steroid use, that is not something that can be done by most of the people that take massive amounts of steroids. So again, we can only speculate. Now here we have 3 back-to-back Olympia dynasties, 3 game changers who challenged what was possible, and each one with their own idiosyncrasies for training. Now the common theme here, if you haven't guessed, is effort. Everyone verbalized the importance of effort in training. Haney in supporting effort over technique. Yates with his post-failure tactics that earned his training the title of blood and guts. And Ronnie with his lack of hesitation to get under impossibly heavy weights when he was fatigued from dozens of sets, getting closer and closer to failure each time. The discussion of effort is similar to progressive overload. The concept seems simple, but there are many applications. Just like progressive overload can be increases in weight or volume, can be done instinctively or on a schedule, can be done slowly or rapidly. Effort encompasses many different ideas. Dorian, along with Mentzer, advocated training to failure that wasn't actually failure, but post-failure training. The real blood and guts happened after you reached failure, when your partner would assist you through forced reps, then when you would drop weight, then continue through partials. It almost seems disingenuous to call it one set, as the ordeal might take 2 minutes to get through. It's perfectly rational that this might take the place of more than one working set in a traditional workout style. With Ronnie and Haney, fluid continuous movement was key, and that allowed fatigue to build faster and continuous tension to stay on the muscle with more weight than they would have otherwise experienced. Dorian's machines featured a different strength curve than free weights, meaning the muscles were under tension the entire rep, whereas free weights have kind of a sweet spot where the target muscle is under the most tension. The point between a full stretch and that sweet spot seems to be where growth is maximized with free weights, which is why you see so many bodybuilders pulsing through length and partials in a bid to torch the target muscle and emphasizing the stretch, if not as part of the exercise, then between exercises. So as for volume, nothing is conclusive with the world's most gifted bodybuilders. We can look at Haney and Ronnie with their 2 times per week multi-set free weight marathons and credit their size and success to the amount of work, just as we can credit Dorian's back to receiving more work than his biceps. But there is no way to know what other factors might have influenced their growth or what they would have achieved if they went with the opposite style of training. Dorian put it best in his book. You've got to experiment and find what works for you, your body type, your goals, etc. Whatever training method you choose, the bottom line is that you have to overload the muscle on a progressive basis and give it plenty of time for repair and recuperation in order for it to become bigger and stronger. As the race to upset Ronnie led to bigger and bigger bodybuilders, the sport continued to swell, both in proportion but also participation. Jay Cutler took second to Ronnie on 4 different occasions before finally upsetting him in 2006 and eventually winning 3 more. In an interview with Greg Doucette, Cutler compares his training to Ronnie, citing that they used a similar amount of volume, but Jay just did all of his in one session, where Ronnie would split it into 2 throughout the week.
Listen, I could get some resistance here because I was once every 5 to 7 days. I was a high volume trainer, meaning I did 20 plus sets per body part. Little extreme. Training with Ronnie Coleman, he liked to do 9 or 12 sets per body part. So he did body parts twice a week. Phil Heath did the same thing.
Jay talked about his motor that no one could keep up with, as he would train a muscle group once every 5 to 7 days, doing a whopping 20 plus working sets per body part. That's not the total number of sets in the workout, that's per muscle group. And he would keep everything in the 8 to 12 rep range, saying if I couldn't get 8 with it, I wouldn't touch it. His rest periods with those weights, those efforts, and those volumes were 45 to 60 seconds. Jay acknowledges his genetics, saying he tried everything and high volume with low frequency was where his growth happened, and his genetics might be partially to credit for that. Ultimately, when giving advice to the masses, he boils it down simply to progression, consistency, and dedication, the rest being open to experimentation. So looking at somebody who spent his entire life competing against, chasing, and training with the best bodybuilders of all time, it looks like it's hard to come to the conclusion that there is one style of training that's objectively better. It seems to be individual preference based on a multitude of variables. Now, worth mentioning in this era were Johnny Jackson and Branch Warren, who never reached Olympia glory, but were world renowned for their crazy workout approaches that took good technique and just threw it out the window. The men standing 5'8" and 5'6" respectively, both weighing on the order of 240 to 250 pounds or 110, 115 kilos, they were often seen training together, and in these workouts, sheer intensity was the name of the game, with zero concern for mind-muscle, dynamic tension, or controlled eccentrics. Like Ronnie, Haney, and Arnold himself, gains centered around the barbell, but a special emphasis on heavy weight being thrown around with maximal speed and force production. Reps were as low as 4, they were as high as 20, and Branch himself was even known for taking later isolation work to 30, 50, or even 100 reps. Now, the mixture of heavy and light weights calls back to Haney's mass and sculpting and to the eclectic training promoted by Weider's principles that called for varying rep ranges to keep things fresh. Johnny was so comfortable with heavy weights that he entered powerlifting meets after his stint as a bodybuilder, not as an early influence, and was known as one of the strongest bodybuilders of his day. He deadlifted 815 pounds, or around 365 kilos, at a body weight of 100 kilos, or 220 pounds, 3 weeks before a bodybuilding show in a depleted state. Now, one might consider that there is value in controlled mind-muscle connection and making lightweights work hard, the way Geronda did all the way back in the Silver era, and one might ask how that stacks up against maximal weights with maximal speed with no concern for such control. Is one better or worse? more or less dangerous, appropriate for some exercises, but not for others? We can only speculate. Counterintuitively, Branch and Johnny are among bodybuilders who trained in this style and never got injured. The body adapts to the stress. I mean, Branch fell off a horse, but that doesn't count. The body adapts to the stress imposed on it, and a lifetime of springboarding weights off your chest can lead to fibers, fascia, and tendons that grow to handle the demands. But there's also a point where the stress overpowers the adaptations and an injury or rupture can happen. The twisting and torquing of arm wrestling makes your bones denser so you can arm wrestle. But it's also the thing that might break an arm wrestler's arm, and often does. This is no different. So predicting your tolerances or likelihood of injury is impossible. When I was 16, I incurred my first pec injury by trying to give a little extra bounce to a 300-pound bench PR, and I've gotten several tweaks since in the exact same spot. Some guys have had full pec detachments. But consider this man benching 600 pounds with an explosive rebound, weighing around 200 pounds. That's a 90 kilo man benching around 270 kilos with an explosively violent rebound. Is this allowed by a genetic predisposition or just a consistent adherence to a style of training that made him strong enough to handle it in the first place? As always, we can only speculate. With him, I suspect a bit of both. Now, steroids make this issue worse as muscles strengthen in a way that outpaces tendons, and it can actually impede collagen synthesis, which makes tendons weaker, not stronger. Compounds known for drying you out can remove water around the joints that provide compression, not only making you feel worse, but potentially increasing the likelihood of some injury or sprain. An overeager attempt at a new PR can quickly lead to muscles ripping or tendons flying off the bone. George Hackenschmidt wrote over 100 years ago before steroids about men who might be prone to ruptures, showing that there is likely a genetic component to durability and risk of injury, and this is reinforced by the stories of the infamous Bulgarian system that chewed up so many talented lifters. Being predisposed to strength or power doesn't necessarily mean that you will possess the lasting ability to go through reckless methods without falling apart. So the advice is to recognize the likelihood of injury depends on how reckless your training is, but also where your genetic line in the sand is, and you're really not going to know the answer to it until you've crossed that line. Now, the monsters of the modern era continue to push size, and the theme of the last decade of bodybuilding seems to be quality of execution and stimulus in a single weekly workout over higher frequency splits. If you consider the all-out full-body effort required for a barbell-centric workout, especially for muscles like legs or back where the entire torso is loaded, it makes sense that recovery might be hindered and the specific stimulus on the muscles might be blunted. But if you imagine that you can take the all-out effort of a Branch Warren and focus it with the surgical application of a Vince Gironda, the specific growth stimulus of any given workout would certainly merit more time to recover from. That seems to justify a split where the same muscle is only trained once per week, using machines and strategies that allow more concentrated stimulus and put the pump on hyperdrive. Modern bodybuilders seem to be favoring workouts where 4 to 5 exercises are done for 4 to 5 sets once weekly, in what one might refer to as the bro split, or what Fuad calls the pro split. Now, many will cite studies that show elevated frequency being better, while others will point to studies that show that more times per week isn't any better as long as volume is equated for. Either way, 7-time Olympian Phil Heath, in addition to the current Olympians of today like Big Ramy and 2023 Mr. Olympia Derek Lunsford, all biased towards a 1 time per week body part split where many sets are done across many exercises. This brings up a modern debate around junk volume, which is the idea that most gains come from a certain amount of work and that excessive volume does nothing but tear you down. There's a few points to consider. An amateur lifter might just move through each exercise, experiencing fatigue and a pump early on, then having subsequent exercises suffer because fatigue is too high. You might see the drop in weight and degradation of form and say, we aren't doing anything useful here, so just shut it down, and you very well may be right. But this individual doesn't have the extreme mass of an Olympian. The question is, what tactics are required to force further muscle growth once you've achieved a superhuman level of muscle in the first place? It seems unlikely that that would track with what is optimal for an average gym goer. How an elite bodybuilder like Jay Cutler or Phil Heath experiences their 20th all-out set is likely very different than someone who is a relative amateur. It also doesn't take into account personal response to stimuli. Again, genetics and steroids play a role, but also the singular goal of an elite bodybuilder to experiment to find what ticks the scale further up. Making a universal statement about junk volume seems to ignore different responses as well as the different ways in which lifters might be approaching their work. It's obvious in watching any of these champions that there is a specific signal they are looking for on any given set, from the first one to the last. Not only does mind-muscle connection take time to gain, but learning exactly how to tweak each exercise as you fatigue throughout a workout is a skill in and of itself, and it isn't obvious to me that those amateur lifters involved in these research studies should be compared to a seasoned vet who knows exactly what to do in each scenario. With studies that involve low-level lifters over short time periods of 6 weeks or so, the dimension of time seems to be the biggest shortfall when it comes to modern exercise science studies. Looking at any videos of any current bodybuilder explaining their training on YouTube, you will find the split in number of sets and reps to be the least talked about part. All of the wisdom comes from how to gain the greatest stimulation in each exercise given your approach to that movement, and how to optimize growth from that singular set or workout. Those strategies done in an environment where the individual can select what they respond to best over years of trial and error seem to matter so much more in this day and age than the splits and rep schemes that we've spent so much time paying attention to so far. Mike Israetel is a force in the industry with a PhD and just a shit ton of experience competing in bodybuilding himself, as well as coaching all types of athletes and bodybuilders. Renaissance Periodization, his brand, takes his basic work with formal sports systems, which uses periodization tactics, and applies it to bodybuilding. He advocates the cycling of training in a way that was hinted at in the past, but rarely specified in the realm of bodybuilding, working up in effort over several weeks before deloading, similar to the block or mesocycle that any powerlifter or strength athlete is very familiar with. It's an effective way to allow big efforts for growth with a sustainable amount of recovery that keeps you growing and avoids burnout. He coined the term stimulus to fatigue ratio, where the question isn't how blown am I right now, but how stimulated is the muscle. The saying goes, stimulation, not annihilation. This coincides with the modern bodybuilding movement, which prioritizes a keen understanding of exactly how to stimulate a muscle and seems to be putting a lot of stock in modern exercise science. Theories abound today about what actually drives growth. A leap forward from crude ideas of building mass and sculpting, we are now at the cellular level and getting closer to isolating exactly how each training decision contributes or detracts from muscle growth. One example is the proposal of stretch-mediated hypertrophy, which is the idea that the length and position of an exercise is the most important for growth. It's the reason that top-end partials are seen as frivolous ego lifting, and the reason that Arnold's deep flies built such an iconic chest. It also explains why, dating back nearly 100 years, stretching as a key to growth seems to be repeated throughout the silver and golden eras. Another example is the effective reps model, which suggests that the actual trigger for growth comes when a lifter is within a certain proximity to muscular failure. It's estimated that 5 reps out from failure constitutes growth reps, and that 3 to 30 reps all seem to be somewhat equally effective for growth, so long as you're training in that proximity to failure. So the idea is that you need slow bar speed to increase mechanical tension and increase the amount of cross-bridging that's going on between the actin and myosin filaments, but you can't just do slow reps and call it good. You also need the all-out effort against that slow-moving barbell. You need the aggressive intent to recruit high-threshold motor units. The point where you're exerting with maximal intent, but the bar is moving slow, that is a few reps out from failure and what is suggested to be the most productive part of the working set. Now, this gives credence to the importance of intensity and effort, which has been acknowledged by just about every top bodybuilder since the inception of the sport, but it talks about it in a more specific term. It isn't the sensation of going hard that's important, but a specific circumstance where the target muscle is working through an effective range of motion, long enough to fatigue and slow down, and with enough effort to recruit those motor units. This gives a lifter much more to sink their teeth into, rather than simply saying, go for the pump, no pain, no gain, feel the burn, and thusly more can be gotten out of a single individual set. Now, in this way of thinking of stimulating reps, you can make workouts more efficient by packing your workouts with as much of those reps as possible, and how you conceptualize volume might change as you start to think about that. Instead of just generic sets, you might think of number of effective reps. It's possible to have a high volume workout with fewer of these so-called stimulating reps if most sets aren't taken to failure and the lifter just experiences metabolic fatigue as a sign that they did enough. It's also possible to have a relatively low volume of work, such as Mentzer or Dorian, where the number of stimulating reps are proportionately higher than the higher volume workout. Now, this doesn't give the HIIT followers a slam dunk, it just shows much of the problems with volume training might be a lack of intensity, not the absolute amount of work being done. Now we can see this on full display as Mike Israetel has an entire YouTube library of workouts where he pushes various bodybuilders and athletes through such workouts, using cruel tactics like myo reps, where the lifter approaches failure and uses very short rest periods to allow them to continue pushing out 2, 3, 4 more reps at a time. Not actually going to failure prevents the rapid drop off in performance where the set would be over, but continuing with only a few reps with the short rest breaks packs the entire set with just a shit ton of effective growth reps, more so than you would get from a normal workout. Now, as the saying goes, all models are wrong, but some are useful. The effective rep model may prove more useful than many of the other earlier generations of bodybuilding superstition, but it seems somewhat incomplete. For one, we have to ask, what does failure even mean, and how do we standardize that across all movements? Any movement can easily push back the goalpost of failure by changing your body position, employing subtle cheating, or by taking an extra breath between reps. How do you control those differences in a study to come to a concrete, effective rep number? Some lifters fatigue faster, meaning the bar speed doesn't slow down until they are at their last rep or two. Is that different than a grinder, someone who can push through many slow reps with tons of effort and high mechanical tension? How would that affect your ideal amount of volume at any given time? Does the 5 reps from failure number hold up with all lifters over all exercises? How do genetic differences affect that? Steroid use? A lifetime of training? We can only speculate. Also, it's important to know that hypertrophy can occur without approaching failure in these specified rep ranges. In today's age, no one would call a snatch or a jerk a hypertrophy movement because they are quick and explosive. The muscle isn't under tension very long, and failure comes up very quick. Failure with a snatch isn't experienced in the same way as failure with a bench or a squat, but work with these movements will still lead to muscle growth, primarily as seen in the early strongman and bronze era lifters. And even with today's Olympic lifters who will do countless dozens of these reps in a workout, periods of high volume and many total practice reps with these fast submaximal reps still correlates with more muscle growth. Now, powerlifters will notice the exact same thing. Elite powerlifters can't train to failure as often, especially in heavy rep ranges, because A, the cumulative wear can be detrimental, and B, the nervous system recovery can often take more than a week, making how strong you are going to be in each workout unpredictable. So those who follow rigid periodized programs that keep effort back get most of their growth by doing more sets with efforts that are decidedly submaximal, oftentimes outside of that 5 reps within failure proximity. Boris Shako's programs are essentially Olympic lifting applied to powerlifting, where skill takes priority, so effort is always low. He has one of the most effective programs by manipulating volume workout to workout by using a pyramid structure where the lifter takes many sets warming up to a top weight, then continues back down, none of them being specifically high effort. These aren't bodybuilding pyramids where there's like high effort, but simple low rep warm-up sets. There's just so many of them. And it turns out that by adding or removing these low effort warm-up sets, recovery can be dramatically improved or stress can be raised. The result of these phases with more total work with light weights, world-class strength along with, yes, more muscle growth. That's just food for thought when you're trying to get a handle on what absolutely causes muscle growth. It might be some of the things we've covered, but it's probably a lot of things that we can't really conceive of quite yet. Now, from the earliest protocols of Hackenschmidt and Goernner to the long power-focused marathons of Reg Park or Ronnie Coleman, from the first Olympic lifting champions to the current powerlifting record holders, volume does seem to correlate with results. Many studies confirm this by showing a clear dose-dependent relationship with volume. The more you do, the more growth you get, even if effort isn't maximal, which suggests that there is something missing from the effective rep model. And that brings us to wrap this monstrosity up. Our takeaways after this exhaustive dive into the training of bodybuilding's legends, we have a few. We have a list of 10, which seems nice and neat, probably neater than it should be. Number 1. Effort is universally the most heavily cited factor for growth, and we find that all the way back at the beginning. Number 2, it seems that attention to stimulus over pure effort makes a workout more efficient and allows you to avoid potential pitfalls of reckless training. Effort can mean a few different things. It can be the heavy, loose form of Ronnie and Haney, or the torturous, slow movements of Geronda. It could be Bill Pearl leaving one in the tank so he can handle more weight over an entire workout, which is an expression of effort. It could be Dorian's aggressive forced reps and drop sets, or it could be something like Haney Rambod's skin stretching FST7 pump work. But the bottom line is you're not going to get anywhere if you're not exerting effort. Number 3, blunt strength work with big movements is an extremely effective method of growth and offers a ton of bang for the buck. but it has its limitations. Progressing weight with low rep ranges is especially taxing and it risks injury over a long career, and that goes double if it's a high volume approach like what Ronnie used to use. This is one of the reasons you see so many modern bodybuilders without the fondness for heavy barbell work as bodybuilders from generations past. By foregoing the fatigue incurred by such heavy work, they can pack their workouts more densely with expert exercise execution in the most optimized ranges. This is in and of itself a skill though. It's one that not everybody's going to get. It takes time to get down, so the trade-off is individual. It's one of the reasons why blunt, strength-focused, mass-building workouts might be appropriate for somebody who's just getting in, who just needs a few things to focus on where there are minimal variations and variables. It doesn't seem like there's a one-size-fits-all. Number 4, different protocols will be better or worse depending on experience and level of development, in addition to what you are most recently conditioned to. But there's a likelihood that there are also genetic components that determine how well you respond to one type of training versus another. This is a very long way of saying results vary, individual stuff plays a factor. The way you capture all of that complexity is by starting with a basic amount of work, moving forward progressively, and taking notes of how you respond. Just like all of the greats we covered, you should be retaining the things you do that work, getting rid of the ones that don't. And if you're not paying attention, if you're not doing things long enough to get good at them, you're not going to be able to piece together what you responded best to. So at the end of a 10-year period, you won't have something that suits your specific needs. You'll just be hopping around from program to program. Number 5, the amount of work you do correlates to growth, but that doesn't just mean all the volume all the time. Arnold had the presence of mind 50 years ago to take his training through phases throughout the year, and some of the biggest cautionary tales are amateur lifters desperate to hit the gas year-round so they can level up quickly. So many months of crushing volume would be well followed up by a period of reduced work with a greater focus on just beating the logbook. And any high-intensity training follower whose gains have slowed would do well to do a simple increase in volume by adding a set or incorporating another exercise, if only for a limited period of time. Moving into deliberate phases of high and low volume is one of the easiest ways to fix a plateau and to make sure that your training is adaptable long term. Number 6, exercise variations can be an effective tool, but aren't necessary. It can help round out development, but too much variation can be a distraction. Instead of trying to find magic exercises, work with the basics and aim to get skill with them. Prove to yourself that you can improve on them, both in how you execute them and in your ability to add weight before jumping ship to something else. Number 7, rep range variation can be an effective tool, but isn't necessary. A wide range of reps causes growth to a somewhat similar degree, with lower reps increasing strength and higher reps increasing muscular endurance. If you spend a lot of time in one rep range, the novelty of changing it with the same movement can often spark further adaptation, but there's also, again, so many people who have gotten very far by fixating on a similar rep range and rotating the other things around. The basic idea is some things eventually have to rotate, but not everything. So you don't need to follow a program where everything is eventually swapping over time, because that leads to too much complexity and you can't figure out what works and what doesn't. Number 8, if heavy weight is part of the game, it's best to start when you are fresh. Dorian was onto this when he talked about fatigue from early sets, lowering your potential for maximal weight on the money set. Pyramids and pre-fatigue work are just fine if what counts as the heavy work for the day is in like a double-digit rep range, but reverse pyramids early in the workout are preferred if you are going to be starting out with low reps. Your 4, 5, 6 rep set is best suited when you're fresh. Number 9, just about any split is justified. You aren't going to find a magic one. If you train a muscle or movement once per week, you need to do more work. If you're aiming for more frequency, you can get away with less. Pick a split that you will actually follow and enjoy, rather than forcing a split that works against your schedule, your personality, or anything else that you prefer because you think it's better, because I promise you it isn't better. And number 10, this is the big one, the first thing we discovered all the way back before Sandow in the era of the Victorian strongman. Progression is absolutely king. Any training approach that results in more weight and work being done over time will lead to growth. When you start a plan, think about getting as much out of the workout, but always pay attention to what happens the next week and the next month. Log your numbers, actively force progress. You can use a double progression, sticking with the same weight until you hit a rep goal before adding weight and then dropping reps and repeating. You can start in a higher rep range for several workouts, and every few workouts or weeks, you can drop the rep range that you're working in to force yourself to handle more weight. There are a lot of options. But if effort is high and you are moving workouts forward, you're going to grow. Pure and simple. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I know this was a huge one. Let me know if you like long form stuff like this, because this is bigger than anything I've ever done. Let me know about your experience with these types of protocols, what you think about this presentation. Leave it in the comments below. Also, check out my Patreon. That's where you can get in touch with me. For $5 a month, I do form checks. I do training advice. I answer questions in DMs. Easiest way to get in touch with me. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.